time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Gorton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Human Services and refers to previous answers he's given in his current portfolio concerning the raids on the AWU when TV cameras turned up before the police. On March 1 last year, the minister confirmed to the House no less than 3 times that neither he nor anyone in his office informed media outlets prior to the execution of the search warrants. Does the minister stand by the 3 answers he gave?
The Minister for Human Services has the call. Members on my left. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the answer to the question is yes, I do stand by those statements. I was Justice Minister for 4.5 years. Every single day, myself and my office dealt with sensitive information. We had protocols associated with dealing with that information, and we continued to make sure that those protocols were adhered to in all circumstances. Now, let me remind the House what this investigation is actually about. The AWU officers were raided in search of documents about wrongdoing by the Leader of the Opposition when he was in charge of that union.
Members on both sides. The Treasurer.
When he was in charge of that union, donations were made to Get Up and to his own campaign fund. Now, the question
Members on my right.
that the Australian Federal Police were investigating about whether those donations were made in a lawful way or whether the law was broken. Now, the response of the AWU has been for 18 months to run interference, to try and close down this police investigation. Now, if those documents don't incriminate the Leader of the Opposition, then why is it that they can't be made public? What is it that the Leader of the Opposition is trying to hide? I don't have questions to answer about this matter.
Member for
the
Isaacs.
Leader of the Opposition does.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline to the House the government's plan for a safer and more secure Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question and her resolute support, like all members on this side of the House, for ensuring that we keep Australians safe and secure, Mr Speaker, whether it's on our borders, Mr Speaker, whether it's in our defence forces, whether it's protecting women in our community, Mr Speaker. Wherever it is, this government, this side of the House, will always be voting for measures that support and strengthen Australia, that strengthen our national security. Now, Mr Speaker, we have a plan that has been working to make Australia stronger, and I outlined that plan again this week at the National Press Club, and I table that plan that takes Australia forward to keep Australians safe and secure into the future. And it's a plan that's working because the first responsibility of any Australian government is to keep Australians safe and secure, and our government is discharging that duty of responsibility, Mr Speaker. And what we saw in this chamber yesterday was the Leader of the Labor Party failed to discharge his responsibilities for national security and protecting our borders in this country. So there is a clear contrast. But the contrast goes wide, Mr Speaker, when it comes to national security. Our plan is to recapitalise our defence forces to get us back from the shameful position which saw defence spending as a share of our economy fall to pre-Second World War levels under the Labor Party. Our plan is to protect our borders, not weaken them as the Labor Party voted to do yesterday in this chamber. Our plan is to disrupt and deny terrorists, and under the great work done by our security agency, 14 terrorist attacks disrupted under the national security arrangements put in place by our government, Mr Speaker. Our plan is to keep women safe by continuing, I acknowledge, the bipartisan work to ensure that we move to the 4th action plan to deal with domestic violence, and just this week further announcements to keep women safe in their homes, Mr Speaker, from the threat of domestic violence. Our plan is to protect children from predators online and in the streets, Mr Speaker. And the child exploitation unit that has been put in place by the Minister of Home Affairs demonstrates a commitment and conviction to that task that is shared by all members on this side of the House. It is our plan to throw criminals out of this country when they commit crimes when they're on visas, and we have done that in 4,150 and more occasions. The Labor Party did less in 6 years than we did in last year alone, Mr Speaker, as they let bikies and criminals and rapists and others stay in the country because they simply don't have the mettle to make the decisions to protect Australia
on both
and to keep Australians safe, Mr Speaker. You have to have a strong economy to deliver all this, but above all you've got to have the ticker and the leadership to deliver it, something that the Leader of the Labor Party does not possess.
Members on both sides. The member for Jellybrand. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Human Services and refers to his previous answer. Is the Minister willing to repeat the answer he gave the Parliament outside of the Parliament without the benefit of parliamentary privilege, and is he willing to provide that statement as sworn evidence to any relevant inquiry?
The Leader of the House on a point of order. Members on my left. Members on my left. The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question is not going to any of the responsibilities of the Minister for Human Services. It's simply a fishing expedition.
Leader of the House will pause. Members will cease interjecting.
The first question asked by the member for Gorton.
Leader of the
Mr Speaker, the first question asked by the member for Gorton quite rightly referred to previous statements that the minister had made, and the minister answered that question. This question is simply a fishing expedition question, and questions of this nature have been ruled out before by speakers, and I'm not sure how the minister can answer a question that's not about his responsibilities either when he was the Minister for Justice or now as the Minister for Human Services.
The Manager of Opposition Business. I'll give an opportunity to address the point of order.
Thanks, Speaker. I first of all refer to previous rulings that we are allowed to inquire into answers that have just been given. I went to nothing further than the specific words that had just been given and asked whether they were willing to be restated in other forums, and in particular whether the minister was willing to provide them as sworn evidence.
Yeah, no, I don't need the Leader of the House. I'm ready to rule on the matter. Look, I listened to the first question very closely, and I think that did have the attachment necessary because it referred to those previous answers. Again, I have a difficulty with this question because it's referring to the previous answer and asking him whether he'll do certain things that aren't within his responsibility, and I just don't think the connection's there. So I'm going to rule that out of order, and we'll go to the next question. The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question goes to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of strong and consistent border protection policies based on the advice of our national security agencies, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that would weaken our national border sovereignty and put at risk people's lives at sea?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and that's a great question from the member for Fairfax, because he, like all members in this parliament and the Australian public, understand the history of border protection in this country. Mr Speaker, when John Howard left office in 2007, there were 4 people in detention, including no children. Mr Speaker, 50,000 people arrived
the
on
Minister
800
will just
boats.
If you just pause for a second, I just want to save a bit of time. The member for Griffith will leave under 94A. She's just warned 10 seconds earlier. The minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, 50,000 people arrived on 800 boats under Labor. 1,200 people, including women and children, drowned at sea, and 8,000 children, Mr Speaker, were put into detention. Now, did Labor listen to the intelligence agencies under the Rudd and Gillard governments? No, they did not, Mr Speaker. They had advice not to change the policies that John Howard had put in place, but they ignored the advice of the intelligence, law enforcement agencies, Mr Speaker, and we know that Labor has learnt nothing since that time. But in December, the Leader of the Opposition instructed 19 of his senators to vote for a reckless bill which will restart boats, and he did it without advice, Mr Speaker. Now, that was bad enough. But this week, the Leader of the Opposition took a security briefing eventually. He was given certain advice in relation to the bill proposed by he and the Greens, and he chose to ignore the specific advice given him by the Director-General of ASIO, by the Chief of the Defence Force, by the General in charge of Operation Sovereign Borders, by the head of my department, Mr Speaker. And if anybody had any doubts about what Labor would be like in relation to border protection, people who thought that maybe the Labor Party had learnt their lesson over the last 6 years,
is now warned. Member for Eden-Monaro is warned.
They thought that Mr Shorten was going to support the government on Operation Sovereign Borders.
Has been warned.
Let me say to those people, have no doubt that this man sitting opposite me is not fit to be the Prime Minister of this country, Mr Speaker. Let there be no doubt about that at all, Mr Speaker. He has shown a reckless, Mr Speaker, a reckless course of action that will see people coming from Manus Island who have been accused of being in sexual relationships with 14-year-old girls. There is a person, Mr Speaker, who stands accused of murder in Iran, who under the Labor Party's proposal will have a right of entry into our country. Now, they can scream all they like, Mr Speaker. They are the facts. They are the facts, Mr Speaker. And far from standing strong on borders, this Leader of the Opposition has demonstrated that he is even worse, that he is even weaker, Mr Speaker, than Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard combined.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much. My questions to the Prime Minister. Malcolm Turnbull has said that he's sorry for not calling the Banking Royal Commission sooner. But since the final report was released, the Prime Minister and members of his cabinet have refused 10 times to say sorry for delaying the Banking Royal Commission for nearly 2 years. Given that Malcolm Turnbull was decent enough to say sorry to the victims of the banks, why is he no longer the Prime Minister of Australia?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I further remember my answer yesterday on the subject of sorries. When will the Labor Party apologise for 50,000 people turning up on 800 boats? When will the Labor Party apologise for 1,200 deaths at sea? When will the Labor Party apologise for destroying the border protection regime that was working? Simple question.
The Prime Minister has concluded his answer. The member for Indi has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, the Select Committee on Regional Development and Decentralisation tabled its report Regions at the Ready in June last year. The report recommends the government develop a comprehensive Regional Australia white paper to provide a clear statement of the government's vision for regional Australia. After a year of analysis, 14 public hearings and almost 200 written submissions, there is enormous interest in the government response, particularly in my electorate of Indi. Is the Prime Minister now in a position to outline a response to the recommendations of the report? Prime Minister, will you please commit to a Regional Australia white paper?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. My government is committed to taking a strategic and long-term approach to regional development. That's demonstrated in the policies that we've pursued as a government and we continue to implement. The Regions at the Ready Investing in Australia's Future report canvassed a range of issues from population, economic growth, employment and livability, as I'm sure the member is aware. The Minister for Regional Services, Sport, Local Government and Decentralisation will table the government response in the Senate later today. We have accepted or noted all of the recommendations, and I understand that the member for Indi has been offered departmental briefings on the response, and I understand she has agreed to undertake those briefings. The government will convene an expert panel to undertake a target assessment of the issues raised in the report, and they will report back to the government by the 31st of March of 2019. In the meantime, Mr Speaker, $641.6 million for 3 rounds of the Building Better Regions Fund, $270 million supporting transformational investments through the Regional Growth Fund, $220 million through the regional jobs and investment packages, $1.3 billion for the National Water Infrastructure Development Fund, and $2 billion for National Water Infrastructure Loan Facility to help identify and build water infrastructure that supports jobs creation and opportunities, $1.8 billion in drought assistance measures and concessional loans to support drought-affected farmers and communities.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Thank you. A point of relevance. The question was, will the Prime Minister commit to a regional white paper?
That was one of a couple of questions, and as I've made the point to members in this situation on numerous occasions, that if there's more than one question on a point of order, you can't demand that just one part of it be answered. The only way to have a minister or a Prime Minister stick to that point is simply to ask them one question. So the Prime Minister is in order.
Speaker, $3.9 billion for the Future Drought Fund, which will grow to $5 billion, and $220 million through the Mobile Black Spot program, co-investing with private sector, states and local government in new mobile telecommunications infrastructure to improve mobile coverage. The specific points raised in the member's question will be addressed in the government's response, which will be tabled in the Senate today.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House how the government's strong economic management is guaranteeing a safe and secure Australia, and what impact would weaker approaches to border security have on the budget?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for her question. And she knows,
member for Bruce,
as we know on this House, on this side of the House, that the first priority of government is to protect its people. And you can only protect your people when you have a strong economy to make the necessary investments, Mr Speaker. And we have a strong economy, and a stronger economy than the one we inherited, Mr Speaker. An economy that is growing at 2.8% compared to 2.1% when Labor was last in government. Unemployment at 5%, the lowest in 7 years, compared to 5.7% when Labor was last in office. A AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies, one of only 10 countries in the world to have so, and a budget that we will announce on April the 2nd that is coming back to surplus, Mr Speaker, the first time in over a decade, Mr Speaker. Now, having a strong economy is allowing us to invest in national security, a $200 billion defence capability plan to bring defence spending to 2% of GDP, investing in 12 new submarines, Mr Speaker, in 12 offshore patrol vessels, in 9 frigates, Mr Speaker, and equipping ASIO and the Federal Police and our enforcement agencies for the task ahead. But I tell you what weakens a country's budget. It's the same thing that weakens a country's national security, and that, Mr Speaker, is weak borders, Mr Speaker. And those opposite presided over 50,000 unauthorised arrivals and a budget blowout and tragic loss of lives at sea. And we've all seen that movie before, Mr Speaker, including the member for McMahon. And the member for McMahon was not watching that movie, Mr Speaker. He was the lead actor, Mr Speaker, because on his watch there were 25,000 unauthorised arrivals. On the member for McMahon's watch there were 398 boats. On the member for McMahon's watch there were 6 new detention centres that were open, Mr Speaker, and on the member for McMahon's watch there was a $5.2 billion blowout because of the weak border policy. That's money that could have helped build 360 schools, Mr Speaker. That is money that could have built 35 hospitals, Mr Speaker, and that money was lost to the budget because of Labor's approach on border protection, Mr Speaker. And it has been said that those who fail to learn the lessons of history are condemned to repeat it, Mr Speaker. And yesterday we saw in this House the Labor Party did not learn the lessons of history, and if given a chance in government will certainly repeat their failures when they were last in office.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why won't the Prime Minister say sorry to the victims of the banks for voting 26 times against the Banking Royal Commission?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, it's the Labor Party that needs to say sorry to the victims of Opus Prime, Mr Speaker. It's the Labor Party that needs to say sorry to the victims of Storm Financial, Mr Speaker. It's the Labor Party that needs to say sorry to the victims of Trio Capital, Mr Speaker, because the Leader of the Opposition was proudly saying when he was the Financial Services Minister that we had the best regulators and the best banks in the world, Mr Speaker. And he did not call a Royal Commission when they were in office for 6 years. And, Mr Speaker, I want to show the Labor Party what a response to the Royal Commission looks like. That's what it looks like, Mr Speaker. It's got a heading. It's got a heading. It's got a title. It's got 40 pages. It's got 76 responses to 76 recommendations, Mr Speaker. The Labor Party have had 8-9 days to respond to the Royal Commission. And what have we seen? We've only seen stunts, Mr Speaker. Now, we want to know what more the Labor Party can give than just they agree in principle. Because we looked up the dictionary definition of in principle, Mr Speaker. It's a general idea, although the details are not yet established, Mr Speaker. It's the details. Now, what is the Labor Party going to do? What is the Labor Party saying to the 17,000 mortgage brokers? Are they going to say to the 17,000 mortgage brokers, small businesses, that they ignore the advice of the Productivity Commission? Are they going to say to the 17,000 mortgage brokers employing 26,000 people that they don't care about competition? Are they going to say to the 17,000 mortgage brokers that they want to give a big free kick to the big banks, Mr Speaker? Are they going to give the big banks a $2.6 billion free kick, Mr Speaker, as a result of their response to the Royal Commission? And, Mr Speaker, what about once-only default when it comes to super? Where is Labor's position? Where is Labor's position? They're turning, they're wriggling, we're going to see some weasel words, but where is Labor's position? Mr Speaker, the member for McMahon has had over a week. He was demanding we respond, demanding we release it so he could rush out his response. But it's nowhere to be seen. The member for McMahon, the member for Hotham, they've gone missing. They're running around the gallery, whispering sweet nothings in the ears of the journalists, saying it will come. Their response will come. It's an in-principle support, Mr Speaker. I tell you what, the 17,000 mortgage brokers, the small businesses across all your electorates want to know, what are you going to do for their future, or are you going to end their businesses in your response to the Royal Commission whenever we get it?
The member for Petrie.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the government's strong border security and border protection policy, such as Operation Sovereign Borders, has been so successful? Is the Minister aware of any threats to this success?
The Minister for Immigration has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, we know what happened under those opposite in this policy area, a humanitarian catastrophe. That's right. 1,200 people lost their lives, Mr Speaker, including children. We'll never know how many. But 1,200 people lost their lives, including children. 8,000 children were forcibly placed in detention. By those opposite. That's what happened. 50,000 people arrived unlawfully. Mr Speaker, in the June quarter of 2013, across the entire Australian youth justice detention system, there were 956 people in detention across the entire youth justice detention network. At the same time, under those opposite, there were 1,820 children merely in immigration detention, twice as many as across the entire youth justice system. Now, we know what we did. We stopped the boats. We got 2,000 kids out of detention. We closed 19 detention centres. We're going to have to come back to that, aren't we? We've resettled more than 450 people in the United States. And very importantly, Mr Speaker, secure borders and the confidence that comes with that underpins a generous humanitarian program. This government has increased the size of our humanitarian program by 35% since it came to office. And this government has provided medical care to those who need it. There are 64 medical professionals on Nauru and there are 418 transferees. That is a ratio of 1 medical professional for every 7 people on Nauru, Mr Speaker. And they say there's no medical care, and that is absolutely false. They also say that the bill that they voted for is about people who are critically ill, but the bill that they brought to this House does not require people to be ill. It merely requires that those people be brought to Australia for an assessment. And that is an extremely low threshold, and the consequence of that is clear. And I want to talk about something else in their bill, Mr Speaker. It's called Amendment 14, and it goes to this issue of who this bill will allow into Australia. Now, at the moment, Mr Speaker, you might have relatives or friends or family who want to come to Australia. They're assessed under the Migration Act character test. Skilled employees, tourists, students, everyone. An extensive list of criteria that are applied before those people are allowed to enter Australia. Under Amendment 14, for people coming from Manus or Nauru, those criteria do not apply. They do not apply. So somebody's relative coming to visit them from overseas will have a higher character standard than someone under this bill. It's another failing of those
time has concluded. The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and every member of his government voted against the Banking Royal Commission 26 times. Having delayed the Royal Commission, the government should not delay Parliament implementing its recommendations. Given that the Parliament is only scheduled to sit for 10 days in 8 months, why won't the Prime Minister schedule extra sittings of the Parliament to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the member for McMahon hasn't even provided his response to the Royal Commission, and he wants extra sitting week. Oh, he says we have an in-principle agreement. An in-principle agreement. What is your message to the 17,000 mortgage brokers employing 26,000 people across the country, Mr Speaker? What is your message on once-only default, Mr Speaker? What is your message on once-only default? Does the member for McMahon agree with the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, who said of our approach on mortgage brokers, "I think the government is right to be cautious about going the full way and making the borrower pay," Mr Speaker? That's what the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, ME Bank, Mr Speaker, owned by industry funds, has said about that recommendation. I do not think it's about making the consumer pay, Mr Speaker. And when we talk about extra sitting weeks, none other than the Law Council of Australia said Parliament must hasten slowly. We must take time to get this right. We must ensure a real opportunity to set this right through meaningful reform is not lost in the race to the election, Mr Speaker. That's the Law Council of Australia, sending the Labor Party a message about their stunts, Mr Speaker. Now, we have already taken action, Mr Speaker. We've announced the APRA capability review, Mr Speaker. The minister is talking to the states about putting in place a national farm debt mediation scheme, Mr Speaker. The minister, the member for Bradfield, is working in order to ensure that financial counselling, there's a proper review to avoid the ad hoc approach, Mr Speaker, that is currently underway. We have said we're going further than the Royal Commission when it comes to extending the jurisdiction of the Federal Court of Australia to hear criminal cases in relation to white-collar crime, Mr Speaker. We've said we're going even further than the Royal Commission when it comes to AFCA, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, extending their jurisdiction and remit not back 6 years but back 10 years to hear cases consistent with the period that was examined by the Royal Commission. And we are setting up a scheme of last resort, and I pay tribute to the member for Higgins, for the work that she undertook in that respect. And I pay tribute to the now Prime Minister, who as Treasurer put in place the Banking Executive Accountability Regime, which was endorsed by the Royal Commissioner and said not only should it apply to banks, but it also should apply to insurance companies and superannuation funds. Mr Speaker, we are taking action on many fronts. Indeed, we have legislation before this parliament to implement 2 recommendations of the Hayne Royal Commission with respect to insure super funds and bringing penalties to trustees and directors. Mr Speaker, we are taking action. The Labor Party can't even be bothered with a response.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women. Will the minister update the House how the government's plan for a safer and more secure Australia is supporting the safety of our Australian women?
The Minister for Jobs, Industrial Relations and Women.
I thank the member for Gilmore for her question and also her very strong advocacy and support on behalf of the Shoalhaven Women's Health Centre, which of course is a very important centre in her constituency that helps women and children affected by domestic violence. Every woman in this country has the right to be safe in their community, online, at their workplace and in their home. And we all know the terrible statistics around domestic violence in this country. And we must never forget that every single one of those statistics is a wife, a mother, a daughter, a friend, a work colleague. We must agree as a parliament that it is not right for women not to be protected and safe. The government has in fact got a strong plan to keep women and children safe, to protect them from the scourge of domestic violence. And we have committed well in advance of $350 million in safety initiatives since 2015, including additional funding for 1800-RESPECT, the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence counselling line. It is a counselling line that will deal in this financial year with around 160,000 contacts and is a vital resource for those people who are experiencing traumatic events. As part of the Women's Economic Security Statement, the very first time that we as a parliament have delivered a Women's Economic Security Statement, we provided $14.9 million to Good Shepherd Microfinance for no interest loans to help women to be able to rebuild their financial security in a safe environment. The government has extended funding of more than $42 million for specialist domestic violence units and health justice partnerships, which will help women and children with legal advice and health services when they have experienced family and domestic violence. And for the first time, we have enshrined 5 days of leave for domestic and family violence as a minimum workplace right in the National Employment Standards. But of course we're doing more and must do more. Only this week the government announced $60 million of additional investment in emergency accommodation, something I know that is a particular passion project for the Minister for Social Services, as well as $18 million of continued support to help keep women and children safe in their own homes. Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister has said, domestic violence is a national security issue, and it is a commitment for every single one of us in this place and at all levels of government. I hope it continues to receive bipartisan support.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. It is a matter of record that after Labor called for a Banking Royal Commission in April 2016, many Australians were still subsequently ripped off by the banks. How many people does the Prime Minister think suffered during the 600-day period that he opposed Labor's Banking Royal Commission? And will the Prime Minister at least say sorry to this group of victims who suffered because of his decision to put big banks ahead of the victims of banking scandals?
The Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, we're waiting for the Leader of the Opposition's response to the Banking Royal Commission. And so are 25 million Australians, because they're sick and tired of your stunts, Mr Speaker. They're sick and tired of these stunts. The member for McMahon is desperate for us to put out the Banking Royal Commission report so that he can respond. A week later, we've seen nothing, Mr Speaker. Absolutely nothing. The member for Hotham said they will agree to every single recommendation. Well, where are the start dates for their response, Mr Speaker, on the Banking Royal Commission? This is what the Leader of the Opposition said back in 2012. Our banks are amongst the best in the world, Mr Speaker. He said, we all know it's easy perhaps for politicians, current politicians, to go to extremes, but banks do have to make a profit, Mr Speaker. That's what the Leader of the Opposition said. That's what the Leader of the Opposition said. Now, Mr Speaker, we are getting on with legislation in this parliament to implement recommendations of the
Treasurer resume his seat.
Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, on direct relevance, I asked the Prime Minister if he'd apologise, but the other part of the question, which I suppose the Treasurer can answer, is how many Australians, how many people suffered during the 600-day period that the government refused to have the Royal Commission? How many victims were there?
The Treasurer, member for Gilmore, the Treasurer has the call. As the Leader of the Opposition knows, there are a number of aspects to the question. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the Royal Commission looked back at misconduct a decade, which included misconduct that occurred on your watch, Mr Speaker, when the Leader of the Opposition had Trio, had Storm Financial, had Opus Prime, and had a Leader of the Opposition who was then the Financial Services Minister of this country, who was running around saying our banks were the best in the world, Mr Speaker. A Leader of the Opposition who was then the Financial Services Minister who said our regulators were the best in the world, Mr Speaker. A Leader of the Opposition who was then the Financial Services Minister who didn't call the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker. When we came to government, we called the Murray Financial Systems Inquiry, and we've been implementing the recommendations ever since, and now with the Hayne Royal Commission we are implementing its recommendations.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney-General update the House on the impact on the justice system of weakened border protection?
Good question.
The Attorney-General has the call.
Mr Speaker, the members opposite want to make a bit of noise because they voted 22 times in the Senate for a bill that would have radically limited the minister's discretion over transfers, even the transfers of serious criminals. And we said that that was absolutely untenable. A few days ago, they produced an advice that said that that wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem according to their advice. We argued that you could not leave no ministerial discretion to exclude people who'd perpetrated murder or serious sexual assault from transfer to this country. Labor then recognised that problem and they produced a new but not so different amendment last night. The new amendment still radically decreases the minister's discretion, and it does not solve the problem because it only retains some discretion if the person has been sentenced for a serious criminal offence, because the transfer would expose the Australian community to a serious risk of criminal conduct. Now, there are very serious problems with that amendment that was pushed through this House last night, and we never got the opportunity to debate those problems because they, with the help of the Greens, gagged debate on those serious issues. And what was it that you did not want to talk about last night? Well, there is no discretion for this government or our minister to stop the transfer of a person who's being investigated for, charged with or on trial for, or even awaiting sentence for a serious criminal offence. And this isn't a hypothetical issue. We are well aware of the reporting of a potential transferee on Manus Island charged with 4 counts of sexual penetration of a minor under the PNG Summary Offences and Crimes Against Children Act. We're aware of another potential transferee who's been charged with an indecent act with a child under 16, detained in Nauru and yet to have their first court appearance. There is another potential transferee charged with assault of a treating psychiatrist. None of those cases could result in the minister exercising the discretion to stop the transfer. So just think about what we were prevented from debating last night. 2 doctors could initiate a process where the minister has no discretion to bring someone to Australia who is charged with assaulting a doctor offshore coming to Australia to get further assessment by a doctor onshore. And we could not stop that transfer. That is absolute madness and something that we were stopped fulsomely debating last night. What a ridiculous situation that you gagged debate and rammed through such an outrageous situation where ministerial discretion is reduced over serious criminality. And you know what? If they had such a big win last night on border protection, why not a single question on it today? If it was such a magnificent evening for you,
the Attorney General's time has concluded. Member for Gorton. The member for Hotham.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister regret describing the Royal Commission as a populist whinge? Given that this sort of attitude delayed the Royal Commission for almost 2 years, why is the Prime Minister repeating his mistake by refusing to schedule extra sittings to implement recommendations of the Royal Commission?
Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, does the member for Hotham regret hitting 5,000 people in her electorate with a retirees tax, Mr Speaker? Does the member for Hotham regret that? The fact is of the matter is we are the only side of politics in this place that have provided a formal and comprehensive response to the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker. The member for Hotham said that they were going to implement every single recommendation, yet the Australian people have seen nothing, Mr Speaker. They have seen nothing other than an empty press release with no details. What do you say to the 17,000 mortgage brokers across this country, including in your electorate, and the 26,000 people that they employ? When do you start to end their business? When do you put them out of work? When do you give a big free kick to the banks, Mr Speaker? Only the coalition, only the Liberal and National parties in government are delivering a formal, comprehensive response to the Banking Royal Commission, taking action on all 76 recommendations.
The member for Dawson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House as to how the government is keeping Australians safe and guaranteeing essential services? Why is it important to stay the course and continue to invest in measures to keep Australians safe?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And if what happened in this House yesterday was so important and what happened over in the Senate last night was so important as well, Mr Speaker, why not a single question in question time from those opposite? They are embarrassed, Mr Speaker. They are absolutely embarrassed. And we've got the member for Gorton, the member for Watson and the good old member for McMahon. They were former members for immigration. They were embarrassing on their watch. We saw 50,000 people arrive on 800 boats. We saw 1,200 people die at sea. Mr Speaker, they are weak on border protection. They are weak on the economy. What they want to do is jack taxes up. $200 billion worth of new taxes. Thank you to the member for Dawson for his question, Mr Speaker. Whilst Labor are focusing on political point scoring about the Banking Royal Commission, I don't know why. The member for Maribyrnong had 6 long years. He was Assistant Treasurer, he was Minister for Financial Services in the Gillard-Rudd years, and not once did he ever show any interest in a Royal Commission then. Why is he so interested in it now? But that's all they're interested in. But the member for Dawson is interested in national security. The member for Dawson is interested in infrastructure. We are committed to the safety and security of the travelling public. Upgrading security screening technology at airports is one of the most effective changes that we can make, and we are making it. Equipment upgrades include advanced X-ray and body scanning technology. The member for Dawson understands how important this is. Our program includes investment to ensure regional airports are made safer. I don't know why the members opposite find that amusing, but regional airports need that safety and security. And working with the airports and stakeholders, we are providing $50 million in funding to support eligible regional airports to purchase or upgrade equipment. Funding for equipment will be distributed through the Regional Airport Security Screening Fund Grants program, and funding will vary from airport to airport depending on their individual requirements, because no two airports in Australia are the same, and certainly no two regional airports are the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but regional airports and securing the safety of the travelling public is only one part of keeping Australians safe. Another part is keeping our borders safe, and we as Liberal and Nationals are doing just that. And also investments in such things as the Mackay Ring Road. Essential services. Essential services. You can have essential services, Mr Speaker, when you have a strong economy, and we have a strong economy. Improving health outcomes, putting more drugs on the PBS, life-saving drugs such as Orkambi for cystic fibrosis, Lynparza for ovarian cancer, and the various other cancer drugs that the Minister for Health has been able to put on the PBS because we've got a strong economy. What do those opposites stand for? $200 billion in new taxes.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm reports that he was the last senior member of the government holding out against holding a Banking Royal Commission? Can he also confirm he is the key senior member of the government now holding out against extra sittings of the parliament to finally implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission he delayed?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, can the member for McMahon confirm that there are 3,000 retirees in his electorate that he's told don't vote for Labor, Mr Speaker? That he said don't vote for Labor. Because the reality is the member for McMahon has had an opportunity to provide to the Australian people a comprehensive formal response to the Banking Royal Commission. Despite all the huff and the puff of how important this is, he's been left wanting, Mr Speaker. He's been left wanting with empty hands, Mr Speaker, with empty hands. What, as the member for McMahon, saying to the 17,000 mortgage brokers across the country, including his electorate, employing 26,000 people? Is he saying that he will back the government and the judgment of the Reserve Bank Governor of Australia, who said we were right to be cautious about changing the fee model for mortgage brokers? Or is he going to back the member for Hotham, who said that we are going to accept and implement every single recommendation, Mr Speaker? The reality is the member for McMahon not only was a complete failure as the Minister for Border Protection, Mr Speaker, with 25,000 votes, but now as Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker, has come up with a genius of a plan to slug Australians with $200 billion of taxes, Mr Speaker. Taxes including a retirees tax, and he's offended over 1 million Australians by telling them that if they don't like the policy, don't vote for Labor, Mr Speaker. That was the most arrogant dismissal of the real concerns of over 1 million Australians. And it's a display of arrogance that the Leader of the Opposition has dared not repeat and to back up his Shadow Treasurer, Mr Speaker. And the question is, how long will it be before the Labor Party crab walks away from their retirees tax? And if they don't, Mr Speaker, then over 1 million Australians will make their feelings concerned at the ballot box.
Treasurer's concluded his answer. The member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I ask the Defence Minister if he would update the House on how the government is protecting Australians and our national sovereignty through appropriate investment in the Australian Defence Forces and in the capability that they rely upon, and how does the government's approach to protecting our national security and national sovereignty differ from other approaches?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Menzies for his question. And I can confirm with him that the government continues to invest in significant military capability. Just on Monday, we signed a strategic partnering agreement with France and Naval Group to deliver the 12 submarines, a $50 billion project, 12 submarines built here in Australia using Australian workers, Australian steel, Australian know-how. And since we rose last December, Mr Speaker, we also took charge of the first two of our Joint Strike Fighters, the F-35As, an $18.5 billion program, delivering 72 F-35As to the Australian Air Force. Because on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we know that defence capability is a very important priority of any government. We understand national security, we understand defence, and you can trust this side of the House to deliver on national security and on defence. In fact, Mr Speaker, on this side of the House you can trust us to get to 2% of GDP being spent on defence by 2020, a year earlier than we promised. On the other side of the House, when they were last in government, they managed to get defence spending down to 1.56% of GDP, Mr Speaker, the lowest level since 1938, the lowest level since the last year of appeasement, Mr Speaker. And since the Second World War, we are investing more in our military capability than any government in our peacetime history. And on this side of the House, we're very proud of that, Mr Speaker. But I was pleased when I was reading the consultative draft of the Labor Party's National Policy Forum, which was to be debated in Adelaide at their national conference. I was pleased to see in Article 44 Labor is committed to achieving and maintaining spending on defence at 2% of GDP. Good news, I thought, Mr Speaker. I thought the Shadow Minister for Defence has finally had a win. He doesn't have much of a profile, but he's finally had a win. But imagine my, he's often, except when he's on my show. But imagine my dismay, Mr Speaker, when I read the entire document as it was presented at the National Policy Conference of the Labor Party, their entire platform, their final document. And you know what? Number 44, about 2% of GDP, didn't make it into the final document. It was in the consultative draft. It didn't make it into the final document. So the Labor Party is not committed to 2% of GDP being spent on defence. The member for the Shadow Minister of Defence lost that argument to the left. The left nobbled national security yet again in the Labor Party's platform.
The member for Greenway, the member for Herbert has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister find it so hard to just admit he got it wrong when he blocked the Royal Commission? Why is he repeating the same mistake with his part-time parliament, which will stop recommendations of the Royal Commission being implemented before the election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for her question. I refer to my answer on this yesterday, but I am very surprised that the member for Herbert would not come in here and ask me about what we're doing to support the people of Townsville during the floods.
Members on my left. Member for Cowan. The member for Cowan. Members on both sides. The member for Canning has the call. Member for Canning has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Personnel. Will the Minister update the House on the role played by the Australian Defence Force in our strong, consistent approach to border security? What impact have previous approaches to border security had on the men and women of the Australian Defence Force?
The Minister for Defence Personnel.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the member for Canning for his question, acknowledge his work in representing the veterans in Western Australia. He certainly understands the issues and is a very strong champion of their issues in this place. Mr Speaker, the Operation Resolute is the ADF's contribution to Australia's civil maritime security in support of Operation Sovereign Borders. And around 350 ADF personnel support Operation Resolute, and this figure may vary from time to time depending on the number of assets that are deployed at any given time. And since 1999, Mr Speaker, 26,000 of Australia's ADF personnel have deployed on border protection operations. Now, Speaker, what concerns me is that Labor's policies, when in government, effectively sent a green light to the people smugglers and had a real impact on the men and women of the ADF. Now, under Labor, the operational tempo was extreme, placing our personnel in danger and exposing them to horrific scenes. Now, those opposite may complain, but this is a matter of fact. This was the unseen cost of the border protection policy failure under Labor. Remember, as we've heard again today, over 50,000 people arrived in over 800 boats, and tragically there were 1,200 deaths at sea that we know of. And as a local member and also as a minister, I have the rare privilege to spend time with our personnel both in training and while on deployment. But sadly, Mr Speaker, I also have to sit with serving members and veterans who have been traumatised by their experiences.
and personnel were exposed to the traumas of boarding unseaworthy vessels, recovering drowned men, women and children. We know that Navy personnel had to recover bodies, many of which had been in the water for days and were decomposing. Navy personnel talked to me of the sensory overload, the smell of diesel fuel, of vomit, of rotting wood, of children screaming and adults crying. And I know, Mr Speaker, this is confronting, it's sickening, but it's true. This is not about politics, Mr Speaker. There is nothing humane about policies which lead to people drowning.
The member for Eden-Monaro has already been warned twice
About sending our ADF personnel to pick up the pieces, and there is nothing humane about subjecting them and their families to the nightmares which have followed, Mr Speaker. The emotional and the physical impact of exposure to these experiences can have and have had long-term consequences for some veterans and their families. So I simply take this opportunity, Mr Speaker, to thank them for their service and thank them for keeping us safe and protecting our borders. Mr Speaker, our Defence Force members and their families will carry an enormous burden if the people smugglers get back into business. And I take the opportunity, Mr Speaker, to advise both our current and our former serving members
Special Minister of State
and their families that the Open Arms Counselling Service is available for free support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on 1800 011 046. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The member for Longman.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister stubbornly refusing to schedule extra sitting days of the Parliament? Doesn't this just show that this Prime Minister will always side with the top end of town?
The Treasurer.
Well, the member for Longman might want to listen to the advice of the Law Council of Australia, Mr Speaker. The member for Longman might want to support legislation that's currently before the Parliament to implement the Hayne Royal Commission findings, Mr Speaker. The member for Longman may want to acquaint herself with the work that we are doing in relation to financial counselling and setting up a farm debt mediation scheme, Mr Speaker. The member for Longman might want to know about the APRA capability review that we have announced under the leadership of Graham Samuel, Mr Speaker. The member for Longman might want to have a word to the member for McMahon and the member for Hotham to tell them to get their skates on and come up with a response to the Royal Commission that they've had for more than a week. The member for Longman might be more interested in serving her constituents with a real response to the Royal Commission rather than the political stunts that we've seen from those opposite. And the member for Longman might want to apologise to the 4,356 constituents in her electorate who the member for McMahon said don't vote for Labor because they don't want a retirees tax, Mr Speaker. The member for Longman might want to know the facts before she gets up in this place and makes it very clear that she's not interested in real outcomes for real Australians.
The member for New England.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question, Mr Speaker, is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister advise the House what measures the government has taken to address the decision of the Parliament, moved and supported by the Australian Labor Party and the Independents, to weaken Australia's border protection regime?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for the question. It's something I thought the opposition might ask me today, Mr Speaker, but they clearly have no interest in the consequences for the weakness they displayed in this chamber yesterday. Last night, the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Immigration met with the Operation Sovereign Borders personnel, as I understand, and this morning the National Security of Cabinet was convened to address this very question. We took the advice and recommendations of our security and border protection agencies, something the Leader of the Labor Party failed to do when he came into this place yesterday, Mr Speaker, and wilfully weakened Australia's border protection regime. The recommendations we have taken is to strengthen the posturing and the positioning and resources of Operation Sovereign Borders as required by those who advised us to do so. Secondly, we have commenced the process of reopening Christmas Island as recommended we should do so to deal with the issue of any possible future arrivals as well as any transfers that may now take place. I have also asked the Home Affairs Department to provide advice on the implementation of the measures that were set out in the parliament yesterday and were voted upon, moved and supported by the Labor Party in defiance of the national security advice that they were very well aware of, Mr Speaker. There is an eerie ring to what we are seeing, Mr Speaker. The leader of the Labor Party stood here last night and he talked about getting the balance right on border protection. I remembered that phrase very clearly because there was another leader of the Labor Party who said just that. It was Kevin Rudd. He said our policy is clear-cut. It's balanced. We've got the balance right, Mr Speaker. A balance that led to 800 boats, 50,000 arrivals, 1,200 people dead at sea, all on the heads of those who sit opposite, Mr Speaker. All on their heads, on your head, your head, your head and your head. They were all there willing it on, Mr Speaker. And I remind them of the words of Senator Evans, who said this, the Minister for Immigration under the Labor Party. The scrapping of TPVs fulfils the Rudd government's commitment to providing refugees with a fair and certain outcome. He said the measure would not compromise the government's commitment to protecting Australia's borders. He said that on the 13th of May 2008. 2008, and we know what followed. That set the boats running again. This leader of the Labor Party does not have the strength to lead this country, to keep Australians safe and secure, and he demonstrated his weakness in this place yesterday beyond measure. The Australian people have got this man's number, Mr Speaker, and it comes up a big fat zero when it comes to strength to secure our borders.
Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. The Prime Minister. I'm trying to call the next question. The member for Cowan has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why is the government claiming that the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission can't be implemented before the election, while yesterday saying it was possible to start legislating the recommendations? Isn't the truth that this government just can't be trusted to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission?
The Treasurer.
Well, I'd say to the member for Cowan, she should have a word to the member for McMahon and tell him to get his skates on and produce a response to the Royal Commission, Mr Speaker. From those opposite, we've had zip, zero, nothing, nutter, nothing. Mr Speaker, zilch. Where is the Labor Party's response to the Royal Commission? All we have seen is stunts, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, the evil Knievel of Australian politics, Mr Speaker, the stunt master. The stunt master. On this side of the House, we have delivered a 40-page comprehensive response to the Royal Commission. We are taking action on all 76 recommendations. The Labor Party are telling 17,000 mortgage brokers employing 26,000 people that they don't care about their future. That they don't care about their future. They want to end their business model and they want to send their business to the big banks, Mr Speaker. I'd just say to the member for Cowan that if she was really interested in focusing on those people across her electorate, the 3,173 people who will be hit by Labor's retirees tax and the 9,443 people in Cowan who will be hit by Labor's housing tax. If she really cared for her constituents, she would tell the Labor Party to drop those bad policies and produce a formal response to the Banking Royal Commission.
The member for Denison. Jump first.
Yes, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, as you acknowledged yesterday, the devastating Tasmanian bushfires are taking a dreadful toll on the community and environment, particularly in the World Heritage Area. Indeed, the Tasmanian Government is concerned that the National Disaster Relief and Recovery arrangements will not cover all of the costs, which led Premier Will Hodgman to write to you on the 25th of January requesting the federal government make an extra contribution outside of the normal arrangements. Prime Minister, do you agree to the Tasmanian Premier's request, and what other assistance will the federal government provide to Tasmania to help deal with the damage bill from these terrible fires?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question on a matter that I know is of extreme importance in his community and all across Tasmania. As I outlined in my letter to Premier Hodgman, who I was able to be with down in the Huon Valley, we were able to meet with emergency workers, with firefighters, with those in the response centres and the evacuation centres. I wrote to him and I told him on the 6th of February that, of course, our thoughts are with those communities impacted by the recent fires and commending the efforts of the firefighting response. In particular, as you know, we've had about 1,500 firefighters rotate through Tasmania over this period of time, and particularly in those deep wilderness areas. The specialist firefighting support that has come out of New Zealand, that has been astonishing and fantastic, and I want to thank particular Prime Minister Ardern and the New Zealand Government for their support. Assistance, including the cost to cover certain firefighting costs, is already being provided under the jointly funded Commonwealth State Disaster Recovery Funding arrangements in the local government areas of the Central Highlands, Derwent Valley, Huon Valley and West Coast. Assistance under the DRFA may also be extended in exceptional circumstances to cover the costs of protecting cultural and environmental assets, similar to the January 2016 Tasmanian bushfires recovery response. Our government stands ready to assist Tasmania with any assistance that may be required in relation to the ongoing bushfires, and in this context I've offered Premier Hodgman the assistance of an Emergency Management Australia Recovery Liaison Officer to help with the preparing their request for additional recovery assistance. So, in other words, working with them to work out what the ask is so we can then seek to meet that ask. I have asked and committed to fast-track any request for assistance as a matter of priority to aid the recovery of Tasmanian communities. And I'd also say this. With the significant fires that have ravaged through Tasmania, it's important for Australians to know that places like the Walls of Jerusalem, for example, Cradle Mountain, all of these incredible natural assets have been untouched by those fires. And as was said by the member yesterday from the opposition, the best way you can help Tasmania as well is go to Tasmania. It is beautiful, and the people are just as friendly, the coffee's just as good, the food's just as fantastic, and there are large areas of Tasmania that have not been affected by those fires, and I would encourage very much Australians to go and take that opportunity. I've also spoken directly to the Premier about what will be needed to support the recovery of the tourism sector operators in the affected areas. I met with some of them when I was there with the Premier recently, and we're working together through our offices to work up a plan with the Tasmanian Government about how we can provide that support. But that is a plan that will have to come from the ground up, and I would invite the men to be very much part of that.
The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Families and Social Services. Will the Minister update the House on how the government is keeping Australians safe and secure by combating violence against women and keeping women and children safe in their homes? Is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches that would not have the same outcomes for vulnerable women and children?
The Minister for Families has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for North Sydney for his question. He's been a strong champion on the need for appropriate support for women and children facing the threat of domestic violence. He's worked closely with Mary's House in Delvina in his electorate, and through that experience he is acutely aware of the shortage of emergency accommodation for women escaping domestic violence, as indeed am I from my involvement with the Hornsby Ku-ring-gai Women's Shelter in my electorate of Bradfield. The facts are shocking, Mr Speaker. 8 women are hospitalised every day in Australia due to domestic violence. And when a woman needs to leave her home because of the threat of domestic violence, very often she has virtually no time to prepare. She may well be jumping in the car with just the clothes on her back. She may have bundled a couple of the kids in the car as well. And then the question is, where does she go? And there is a shortage of emergency accommodation, which is why the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday was so important. The Prime Minister committed, as part of an overall $78 million commitment, that there would be $60 million provided over 3 years to provide capital grants to eligible organisations to provide new or expanded emergency accommodation facilities. The grant program will encourage contributions from other levels of government and from private and philanthropic sources, and it's estimated to create some 450 additional places, and some 6,500 people a year are likely to be able to find refuge in this emergency accommodation. This funding of $78 million Mr Speaker, on top of the additional funding we've committed. For example, $10.9 million in November last year, additional funding for 1800-RESPECT. This funding is possible because of our strong budgetary management. When we make this commitment, Mr Speaker, we know we can pay for it. And I'm asked if there are any other approaches. And I'll tell you, Mr Speaker, you know that when the member for Kooyong stands up in a few weeks' time and announces a surplus, the people of Australia can be confident that surplus will be delivered. And that's a very stark contrast from when the member for Lilly stood up and promised a surplus, which they comprehensively failed to deliver, not once, not twice, but 4 times, Mr Speaker. A strong budget is absolutely critical to be able to deliver the services that Australians rely upon. Services like emergency accommodation for domestic violence, services across the breadth of my portfolio, across health, across social services. Our government, our Liberal National Government, can be relied upon to maintain a strong budget, a strong economy, and therefore to be able to dependably fund the services that Australians rely on.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And on that note, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice board.